Good day. Just a month after the Geneva summit between the US and Russian presidents and the attempts that were made there to develop a predictable and stable relationship between the United States and Russia, it is becoming clear that certain people in the United States, people who I would describe as the neocon tendency, but who of course also extend to many people who would classify themselves as on the left, are engaging in a concerted attempt to wreck whatever possibility there is for an improvement in relations with Russia, between the United States and Russia, even if that improvement in relations is at a very basic level, basically an agreement by each side to observe the other's red lines. And it's also becoming increasingly clear that the primary topic that the hardliners or neocons or neoliberals, or call them what you will, are using in order to create problems between the US and Russia and between the US and Russian presidents is the issue of cybercrime and ransomware attacks and such like things, with the claim, which is now becoming not just a claim, but almost, dare one say, a received wisdom or an article of faith in the United States, that most of these cyber attacks or ransomware attacks, even when they're entirely criminal in their nature, originate from Russia and are carried out by criminals based in Russia. Now, as to that, I'm going to quickly express my own personal view. President Putin of Russia has said that the majority of cybercrime originates in the United States. I have no way of knowing whether or not that is true, but I doubt that anybody is able for the moment to say with any clarity or precision where much of this criminal activity takes place or is based, or where much of the crime comes from. Having been to Russia several times, I would say that many people there are, to my definite knowledge, extremely well-informed and familiar and skillful in operating the internet and carrying out cyber activities. And I have no doubt whatsoever that there are indeed cyber criminals operating in Russia. Maybe there are lots of them, and maybe some of them are involved in some attacks upon the United States. I do not exclude that possibility at all. I think it is all but inconceivable, however, that the Russian government itself or its agencies are involved, and I am fairly certain that if the Russians were asked and steps were taken to cooperate with them on the cybercrime issue, then it should not be difficult to get on top of this problem. There was a recent article, by the way, in the Financial Times, which basically said that the way to cope and solve the problem of cybercrime is for the three great cyberpowers, China, Russia, and the United States, to get together and to work with each other in order to solve this problem. The Russians, of course, have long proposed a cyber treaty. I read recently that they've been proposing this ever since 2009. So this has been a long-standing request or demand by them. The United States, for various reasons, has been opposed, but perhaps it doesn't need a treaty but rather basic and straightforward cooperation between law enforcement agencies in order to get on top of this problem. One of the reasons this is so difficult is that all cooperation, to all intents and purposes, between Russian and American law enforcement agencies basically ended after the 2014 Ukrainian crisis. And of course, the United States has now made a law enforcement cooperation with the Russian law enforcement agencies even more difficult by imposing sanctions upon them. So we have many problems in this field, problems which certainly could be sorted out if there were any degree of goodwill. And I'm fairly sure that the Russians, as I said, have an interest in getting on top of this problem, just as the United States has. And I'm sure the same applies to China also. So, but of course, none of this prevents some people whose concern, I suspect, is less to do with cybercrime or ransomware or any of those issues, to focus upon it as a way of creating trouble between Washington and Moscow. And the New York Times, which is always at the forefront in these sort of campaigns, is, of course, in the forefront on this one. So, for example, we have an article by a journalist, a Mr. Sanger, which makes the following claims in relation to a telephone conversation which President Biden and President Putin had with each other on Friday, in which, amongst other topics, they discussed cybercrime. And this is what this article in the New York Times says. President Biden warned President Vladimir V. Putin of Russia on Friday that time was running out for him to rein in the ransomware groups striking the United States, telegraphing that this could be Mr. Putin's final chance to take action on Russia's harboring of cyber criminals before the United States moved to dismantle the threat. In Mr. Biden's starkest warning yet, he conveyed in a phone call to Mr. Putin that the attacks would no longer be treated only as criminal acts, but as national security threats, and thus may provoke a far more severe response, administration officials said. It is a rationale that has echoes of the legal justification used by the United States and other nations when they cross inside another country's borders to rout terrorist groups or drug cartels. Now, that is an extraordinary paragraph in this article, and perhaps we should take a step back and take stock of what is being suggested here. Firstly, we have a claim that this telephone call between Biden and Putin amounted to an ultimatum of some sort by Biden to Putin to act against these cyber criminals who were based in Russia. And we are told that the United States, if such action is not taken by President Putin and his government to deal with cyber criminals, these actions, these cyber attacks, these ransomware attacks, will be treated not only as criminal acts, but as national security threats. And we read that in that case, the United States will move to dismantle the threat, and that this has echoes of the legal justification used by the United States and other nations when they cross inside another country's borders to rout terrorist groups or drug cartels. So that appears to say that not only did Biden give Putin an ultimatum, but that he basically told Putin that if Putin didn't take action against these cyber criminals, then the United States will by itself, in order to dismantle this so-called threat, and this could involve American military or police action across Russia's borders into Russia itself in order to arrest cyber criminals there. In other words, armed US troops will cross Russia's borders and enter Russia itself to arrest people there. Now, that has not happened at any time since the period of the Russian Revolution, when for a short time the United States actually did deploy an expeditionary force in eastern Russia as part of the US policy of trying to support the White Russians who were at that time fighting the Bolshevik-led Red Army. So it would amount, in effect, to a US military police action on Russian territory. Now, that is an extraordinary thing to say, and I have to say that given that Russia is a nuclear power and a military superpower, it strikes me as being completely bonkers. I mean, it goes beyond any threat, for example, of taking action in the form of a cyber attack or a counter cyber attack against Russia. It implies military action against Russia itself. Now, that supposedly is being telegraphed to President Putin by Biden. He's actually threatening in some form Russia with some kind of military attack. Now, I have to say, anything more reckless, anything more borderline insane, I simply can't imagine. And since I am absolutely sure that neither the New York Times nor Mr. Sanger are insane, I can only assume that this is incredibly inflammatory and very remarkable. Now, note that the comment is these threats, these claims in this New York Times article are attributed to administration officials. Now, that's very interesting because actually, for once, the White House has actually published the text of a briefing that administration officials gave to the media after the Putin-Biden telephone call. And I should make it absolutely clear that it contains no such threats, no such warnings, no ideas or proposals for cross-border military action by the United States into Russia or anything like that. But it does say some quite different things. But before I get on to the claims, the things that these administration officials said, perhaps it might be useful to actually go to the readouts that the two governments have provided about the call, the two readouts that the United States government, the White House, and the Russian government, the Kremlin, have each published. Now, this first is the US readout, which appears on the White House website. President Biden spoke today with President Putin. The leaders commended the joint work of their respective teams following the US-Russia summit that led to the unanimous renewal of cross-border humanitarian assistance to Syria today in the UN Security Council. President Biden also spoke with President Putin about the ongoing ransomware attacks by criminals based in Russia that have impacted the United States and other countries around the world. President Biden underscored the need for Russia to take action to disrupt ransomware groups operating in Russia and emphasized that he's committed to continued engagement on the broader threat imposed by ransomware. President Biden reiterated that the United States will take any necessary action to defend its people and its critical infrastructure in the face of this continuing challenge. Now, this contains no threats or warnings or ultimatums. It doesn't say in any place that the United States will launch attacks across Russia's borders to arrest criminals there. It doesn't even warn of cyber attacks on Russia. It talks instead about the need for Russia to take action to disrupt ransomware, but it also speaks about the commitment by the United States to continued engagement with Russia on the broader threat proposed by ransomware. And then it also says, of course, that the United States reserves the right to take any necessary action to defend its people and critical infrastructure in the face of this continuing challenge. But that, of course, could mean much or it could mean little. We don't know what these words mean. It doesn't seem likely that they have the very ominous meaning that the New York Times and Mr. Sanger allege that they do. Anyway, this is the response, this is the readout provided by the Kremlin of this call, and in some ways it's not dissimilar. The presidents continued their dialogue on ensuring information security and countering cybercrime, which they started at the Russia-US summit in Geneva. In the context of recent reports on a series of cyber attacks ostensibly made from Russian territory, Vladimir Putin noted that despite Russia's willingness to curb criminal manifestations in the information space through a concerted effort, no inquiries on these issues have been received from US agencies in the last month. At the same time, considering the scale and seriousness of the challenges in this area, Russia and the United States must maintain permanent professional and non-politicized cooperation. This must be conducted through specialized information exchange channels between the authorized government agencies, through bilateral judicial mechanisms, and while observing the provisions of international law. The leaders emphasized the need for detailed and constructive cooperation in cybersecurity and for the continuation of such contacts. So that actually points to dialogue and cooperation. We hear comments here about detailed and constructive cooperation in cybersecurity and the need for such cooperation, and the need for information exchange between specialized agencies, specialized information exchange channels, and through authorized government agencies, and the establishment of bilateral judicial mechanisms while observing the provisions of international law. Now, on the specific point that Putin made about the fact that the Russians have received no inquiries on these issues from US agencies in the last month, I think that this needs to be explained in some context. And it goes back to my point earlier that the United States essentially severed all connections with Russian law enforcement agencies back in 2014. There's very little contacts between them now. And of course, it has made communications with these agencies such as Russia's Investigative Commission, the FSB, its Cybercrime and Counterintelligence Agency, Russia's an equivalent in some ways to the FBI. It's made it very difficult for the United States to work with these agencies because over the last couple of years, it has been busy sanctioning them and sanctioning their officials, which makes it all but impossible for the United States to work with these people. And what Putin is saying, essentially here, is that because communications between Russian agencies and US agencies have all but broken down, the Russians have not been able to receive information from the United States about these issues, about these ransomware attacks in the last month. But the talk about setting up information exchange channels through authorized government agencies, through bilateral judicial mechanisms, whilst observing international law, that suggests that the Russians or Putin are proposing some sort of vehicle, some sort of agency, some sort of interagency body that will be able to exchange information between the United States and Russia on cybercrime in order to deal with the actions of cyber criminals. And this is something that the United States appears to be receptive to. I say that because President Biden himself has provided some information about the telephone call that he had with Putin, and he too seems to be talking about the setting up of an interagency body. And here's what he said. And again, I'm taking all of this from a White House transcript of certain comments made by President Biden as he boarded Air Force One a few days ago, just after his telephone call with Putin. And this is what the White House transcript of this call says, of these comments rather say, and it's comprehensive but also fairly short, and I will read it out in detail. Question. Mr. President, does it make sense to attack the servers that are used in Russia to carry out? President. Inaudible. Question. Does it make sense to attack the servers that are used to carry out these ransom attacks in Russia? The President. To attack them? Question. Well, the President. Well, what happened was there was one company that got, they weren't specifically attacking servers, they were attacking businesses. Question. The US response. Up until now, the US response has been to exercise sanctions, impose sanctions on Russia for this malign activity. Does it make sense for the United States to take it up a notch and attack the actual servers that are used? President. Yes. Sir, what are the consequences for Putin if he does not step up against cyber attacks? The President. Well, we set up a committee, joint committee. They are meeting on, I think, the 16th. And I believe we're going to get some cooperation. Thank you. Question. Mr. President, what do you expect President Putin? What do you expect him to do? What are those actions? The President. It's not appropriate for me to say what I expect him to do now, but we'll see. Thank you. Now, it's quite clear that someone, it doesn't say whom, but some journalist is trying to get Biden, President Biden, to confirm that the United States is going to launch some kind of attack, make an attack on the servers. I don't quite understand what that means, but that seems to be consistent with the story about some kind of cross-border raid into Russia to seize the servers, perhaps arrest the people who are carrying out these attacks, that sort of thing. And Biden, the president, is bewildered. He clearly has no understanding of this. And he talks about to attack them, ? And then he says that it's one company that was attacked. And they weren't specifically attacking servers, they were attacking businesses. So he doesn't quite understand the question, which clearly points to the fact that it's not servers in Russia that are going to be attacked. He thinks that this is a reference to servers that are being attacked in the United States. And he says this wasn't a case of servers being attacked, this was a case of businesses being attacked. And then somebody tries to push him into saying this, and he says, will the United States do more? Will it notch up and attack the actual servers rather than just impose sanctions? And then Biden, who's clearly somewhat bewildered at this point, answers with a monosyllabic yes. And then there's a question, a further follow-up question about what will happen to Putin if he doesn't step up action against the cyber attacks. And then Biden says, well, actually, there's going to be a joint committee with the Russians, because that's clear whom he means, and it's going to meet, he thinks, on the 16th. Doesn't say the 16th of which month, but it's presumably July. And then he goes on to say that I believe we're going to get some cooperation. So clearly, what's actually happening, far from the United States threatening and imposing ultimatums and warning about sending armed police presumably, or military people into Russian territory to seize servers and seize and arrest people and treat cyber criminals operating in Russia as if they were drugs cartel type people or terrorists. What he's working towards is some kind of cooperation with the Russians on this issue. And there's a proposal mentioned in the Russian Readout about setting up a joint committee. And it seems that that is indeed going to happen. The two presidents apparently agreed to that. And this joint committee is going to meet on the 16th, presumably of this month. And that Biden, the president, believes we are going to get some cooperation. That's what the transcript of his comments actually says. So let's now get to these administration officials, because very unusually, and I strongly suspect partly in response to this New York Times campaign, the White House has actually provided a full transcript of the administration official and his briefing to the media after the Biden-Putin conversation. Now, I'm not going to read it all out because it's fairly long, but it's important to say, and by the way, this is true, it's very clear from the readouts, both the Russian readout, which I only focus on the cybercrime aspect of it, but also the US readout, that the main topic of discussion of the readout, of the conversation, during the conversation, was not cybercrime, it was Syria. And this is essentially what the White House briefed the journalists about. And it seems that the Russians and the US are cooperating to some extent on humanitarian issues in Syria. And that's very important. And I will come to that in another video. But today I'm going to focus instead, as I've said already, on the cybercrime issue, given the mischief that some people are trying to create around it. So this is what we read. And this is from the White House briefing to the journalists, which is undoubtedly the briefing that we see being distorted in that New York Times article. President Biden also spoke with President Putin, obviously about the ongoing ransomware attacks by criminals based in Russia that have impacted the United States and other countries around the world. President Biden underscored the need for Russia to take action to disrupt ransomware groups operating on Russian territory and emphasized that he's committed to continued engagements on the broader threat posed by ransomware. So, no threat here. He's saying to the confirmation here instead that the United States, that the president, that Joe Biden himself, told Putin that the US is committed to continued engagement on the broader threat posed by ransomware. In other words, the administration wants to work with Russia on this issue. There's no ultimatums, no threats, no final warnings, no lurid talk about American police or military people crossing the border into Russia in some kind of covert way and seizing servers there or seizing criminals. Nothing of that kind. And then we go on to read, the president believes in the leader-level engagement on this issue as well, and we engage in this type of diplomacy, not because we agree often or all the time, but precisely because we have these disagreements in some areas, including this one. So there we are. So this is leader diplomacy, that this means that Biden has decided that the right thing to do is to talk to Putin himself about this issue. He's not just going to leave it to his officials. By the way, that's an implicit way of saying that the United States, including its president, needs to talk directly to the president of Russia, something which we know some people have been unhappy about. And then it goes on to talk about the issues of defense and protection. President Biden reiterated that the United States will take necessary action to defend its people and its critical infrastructure in the face of this continuing challenge. And the president has also called on governments and agencies to modernize their defenses to meet this threat, building on the President's executive order on cybersecurity that was released in May. I want to say a few other things about this. This is the administration official. The President really meant what he said just after concluding the summit meeting in Geneva, when he said that our assessment of this process and our evaluation of Russia's actions would take time and play out over time. The President said 6 months or more. This is more than just a conversation that's taking place between the two leaders, President Biden and President Putin. This is really about our own resilience as a nation in the face of these attacks and strengthening that. That's what the cybersecurity executive order was largely about. It's about addressing the challenges posed by cryptocurrency, which provides fuel for these transactions. It's about ensuring that our allies and our partners are working with us collaboratively and upping our game when it comes to resilience and these broader issues. So this is a broad campaign and won't have an immediate on-off effect like a light switch, but we're going to have to stay on top of this over a period of time and remain focused on it. So, no threats, no talk here about going into Russia and seizing servers. It's about working together with allies and partners, and also to some extent with Russia on this specific issue, to develop security, to strengthen cyber security so that these kind of threats cannot be interfered with, and also about a clampdown on cryptocurrencies, which allegedly provide fuel for these transactions. Now, I know there are some people probably who are following this program who are great supporters and believers of cryptocurrencies, but the administration's policy, and by the way, I want to stress, the policy of the Russian government is to act against cryptocurrencies, and part of the justification of that is because they fuel these transactions. I am not going to say more about this issue. Many people will no doubt have their own comments to make. This is a channel which deals with political and diplomatic issues. But suffice to say that the tone here is about actions being taken by the United States that are primarily security and defensive ones, but which seek cooperation with Russia and which seek also to clamp down on cryptocurrencies in cooperation with the US's allies and with Russia ultimately too. And then we get all kinds of questions from the media about this. And there's discussions here about whether Russia did indeed. There were a whole set of questions about whether or not it's actually true that the US did not communicate its concerns about ransomware attacks to Russia. I've already explained that. The officials said that in fact the United States has communicated its concerns. What Putin's point was not that the United States has not talked about these concerns, but that there is no actual discussion at the moment between law enforcement agencies. That is what his readout, the Russian readout, really is all about. And note again, and it was reiterated in these comments by the administration official, that there is no final warning. The US is going to take time to assess what Russia is going to do. It's going to take a minimum of 6 months, and then eventually, if there is really no cooperation, then the United States will decide what to do. And again, we saw the reference to 6 months in those comments, and it's followed up with further statements like this. On Russia's follow-up actions, look, time will tell. The president was quite clear that part of why he wanted to gauge what President Putin was willing to do with regard to these actions that have taken place from Russian territory was so the United States could gauge what we're going to be willing to do. And I think the president was asked today if he expected us, the United States, to take up follow-up, to take action to follow up. He said, yes, we're not going to telegraph what those actions will be precisely. Some of them will be manifest and visible. Some of them may not be. But we expect those to take place, in the days and weeks ahead. So, in effect, what's going to happen is there's going to be cooperation. There's going to be some kind of committee. If the Russians don't work or seek to work with the United States, there might be more action. Some of it may be in the form of sanctions. That's what the United States always seems to do. But principally and mainly, it will presumably take the form of cyber attacks upon criminals who operate in the United States. The kind of threats that the New York Times was talking about, the sort of attacks on individuals, doesn't seem to be any real sign of that, and it's all going to be invisible. So we will see what actually happens. But all the indications are far from the administration making threats to the Russians over the question of cybercrime and ransomware attacks, that the administration for the moment seems to be trying to work with the Russians in order to resolve this problem and to come to some kind of agreement with the Russians on how to cope with it. It's the opposite of what we see, the neocon tendency in the United States. I call it the neocon tendency, but I would stress again that includes many people who identify as being on the left, perhaps mainly people who in the United States at the moment identify on the left. But anyway, that tendency, that hardline tendency, the tendency that wants confrontation with Russia, it's the opposite of what they want. They're trying to spin it in order to create a new sort of tension and conflict between the United States and Russia, whereas in reality, at the moment, the United States and Russia are, on the contrary, edging towards cooperating and working alongside each other to deal with this problem. So, what's going to happen? Well, I think, first of all, we can put aside any idea of the United States sending armed police and commandos and, special forces into Russia to arrest people there and to seize them there. I mean, that's simply not going to happen. I think if the United States were to try anything like that, it would be a huge disaster, and it would wreck relations between Russia and the United States, and do so in an extraordinary and irretrievable way. Moreover, telegraphing that idea to the Russians is extremely short-sighted and utterly reckless. Of course, there's been talk about cyber attacks. This has arisen on various times. There's been threats of this. Putin discussed it in his interview on NBC. He said that he was aware of the possibility, but he wasn't afraid of it. And I don't think he is, because my own guess is that Russia is probably more insulated from cyber attacks than the United States is. And I think that the United States is wary of starting a cyber war, which would be massively disruptive or potentially disruptive on the US, as well as indeed on Russia, but also on many other countries. So I don't think that is the real danger. All the emphasis is going to be on cooperation, on the two countries trying to work together, trying to find some means to circumvent the problems created by the sanctions, the fact that the law enforcement agencies of the two countries aren't in direct communication with each other. We see Putin suggesting what is effectively an interagency forum to look into this question. We see Biden essentially confirming that there's going to be some kind of joint committee and his expectations that it will meet for the first time around the 16th of July. And we see a timeline from the United States that they're prepared to wait for perhaps 6 months to see what the Russians are going to do, and that they clearly have hopes or expectations that something will come of this. It really is astonishing how steps taken by the two governments to try and at least work together on a joint problem are spun by some people to give the opposite impression, to imply that there is conflict where there is in fact cooperation. Now, unfortunately, the people who talk in this way are not just people who write articles in newspapers. One does get the sense that there is resistance to moves towards working better or more closely with Russia at every level of the US government. And given the realities, the political realities in Washington at the moment, it has to be likely that at some point the hardliners, these people who write in this way, will prevail, and that we will see, perhaps at the end of this 6-month period, a turnaround towards confrontation, with the ransomware attacks being used as justification for it. And by the way, I've been reading some extraordinary demands. There was even one which I read in Washington Examiner, which is, by the way, a conservative media outlet, very much aligned with the Mitch McConnell wing of the Republican Party, where one of its commentators even called at one point for the United States to black out Moscow and St. Petersburg. I mean, extraordinary things like that. We also see now a drumbeat of demands for sanctions to be imposed on Russian businessmen, for their accounts, their private accounts around the world to be seized. An action, by the way, which would delight the Kremlin, which wants all these business people to stop having money overseas, but to transfer it instead to Russia. So we see all of this going on, and it's highly likely, in fact, I would say it's only a question of time before we again see a return to confrontation, because these moves towards cooperation not only seem unconvincing in themselves, but that the fact that they have to be discussed in this roundabout way in the United States shows how difficult it is, even for the US government to cooperate with Russia on an issue like this, and how difficult it is for the administration to justify and explain that to the US media. So I don't have any very high expectations of this process, but suffice to say, and for the moment, it is cooperation with Russia, between the United States and Russia on cybercrime, not confrontation, despite the attempt of certain people to pretend to the contrary. Thank you for joining me in this program today. I look forward to you joining me on other programs on this channel. Please also check out our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. And please also remember to check out Alex's channel. You'll find links under this video. Please also check us out on our other platforms, BitChute, SuperU, and Locals. And please also support us to the extent that you feel you can via PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. Also, don't forget to go to our shop, buy the wonderful things we have there, our famous magic mugs, our hats, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, our hoodies, and all the rest. And please, if you like this video, remember to tick the like button, and also please check your subscription to this channel. And thank you for joining me today. And I look forward to you joining me in future programs, and have a wonderful day until then.